Now that we know the final going rate for Deebo Samuel, do we in Broncos country think that's something the Broncos should have been in on? The Avalanche made a trade over the weekend. So what did we get? And do we think they're done making moves? And finally, coming up at the end of the show, we have a special guest to help us count down the first of many mile-high milestones celebrating the 30th anniversary of Denver Sports 104.3 The Fan. All things to come on today's rundown, but we begin in the NFL, where we saw over the weekend the 49ers and the Washington Commanders complete a trade to send Deebo Samuel to Washington, the wide receiver who was an all-pro in 2021 and one of the league's most dynamic multi-purpose offensive players, will get a fresh start in the nation's capital and look to build back to that production that has steadily declined over the last 3 years since his all-pro season. Now, we had this conversation beforehand when it was made clear by the 49ers brass, Kyle Shanahan, John Lynch, etc., that Deebo was going to be able to search out a trade partner and be able to get a fresh start. He was granted that up front. And we had the conversation. Deebo Samuel is right around the age of 30. Offensively, and what he was asked to do in San Francisco was pretty physically demanding. And there's an argument to be made that maybe the toll is starting to take a little bit more of a chunk each year out of Deebo's potential productivity. And then there's the contract situation. Deebo signed a hefty extension with San Francisco during that time, coming off of his all-pro season. But now, 3 or 4 years removed from that, is the juice still worth the squeeze? Well, for the Washington Commanders, it was worth a whopping 5th-round pick in the 2025 NFL Draft. Part of that is, of course, due to the fact that there's a contract situation attached to that, and there is not an extension promised as of now. We'll find out after the new league year begins in just a couple of weeks, but as of now, there is not a reported promised extension for Deebo beyond this season in Washington, and I think that's telling. As it relates to Deebo Samuel, he went for a 5th-round pick, but San Francisco's retaining none of that salary, which means that the Washington Commanders will fork over $17.5 million in 2025 for Deebo. Now, you have a flexibility to do that if you're Washington because you have a superstar quarterback on a rookie contract in Jaden Daniels, and that allows you to spend at luxury positions to try to put pieces around him. They had some solid production on the defensive side of the ball, but I think it was clear outside of Terry McLaurin, there really wasn't a lot for Jaden Daniels to play with from a skill position standpoint. Deebo is certainly going to be their first attempt at remedying that. So I would expect Deebo Samuel to look and feel a lot of the same way we would have expected him to be here in Denver. But I don't think, in hindsight, even for a 5th-round pick, that the Broncos should have been in on this deal with the benefit of hindsight, because all the same reasons and objections that we had before, in my mind, still stand. Deebo has not proven to be a receiver who is able to replicate that all-pro level production in 2021, and it's gone down by a pretty significant percentage in terms of yards and touchdowns every single year since then. Some of that could be due to fit, and you say, well, there's a dearth of playmakers, sometimes with all the injuries and things like that, and that changes the attention, but it shouldn't. The San Francisco had such an abundance of people who can do things in space with the ball in their hand. You had Brandon Ayuk, you had Jawan Jennings, you had the ultimate X factor in Christian McCaffrey, and Brock Purdy was putting the offense in a pretty efficient, able to move the ball kind of mode for the majority of their games, obviously anchored by the great defense that we've seen for a handful of years there. So the problem is when Christian McCaffrey goes down with a season-ending Achilles injury or his knee injury or his quad issues and the litany of lower body struggles that he's had, and Brandon Ayuk tears his ACL just while the ink is still wet on the contract extension that he signed, Deebo didn't replicate or absorb any of that production. He stayed kind of similar, if not lower, than where he was at the previous year. And I think that's a little bit concerning because here in Denver, we have the same situation. We have a little bit of a barren wasteland outside of Cortland Sutton as it relates to playmakers. Marvin Mims showed some encouraging signs in terms of ways that he can be implemented differently beyond just the special teams game where he's produced at a Pro Bowl level for 2 consecutive years. And it was one of those situations where, as it relates to the Broncos, Deebo would have absorbed a lot of that production. But the problem is he didn't do it in San Francisco, who's got more pieces, and Kyle Shanahan being the ultimate gadget guy in the things that he's able to do and find creative ways to get guys the football. I don't know that Sean Payton would have had a significant uphill battle trying to do the same thing. So for the Broncos, I think it's safe to say there wasn't a big push beforehand to get a Deebo Samuel. And in hindsight, despite the fact that he went for a cheaper draft compensation, I don't think that this was a move that the Broncos should be looking back in hindsight and kicking themselves on. Slight shout out to Adam Peters, by the way, the general manager of the Commanders. By trading for Deebo with a 5th round pick that they got from the Marshawn Lattimore trade as part of the compensation, that means that for essentially a 3rd, 4th, and 6th rounder in 2025, Adam Peters was able to bring in Marshawn Lattimore and Deebo Samuel, 2 pretty significant veterans in the NFL to plug positions of need on a roster that's experiencing a quick turnaround similar to what we're hopefully seeing in Denver. Quickly on the Colorado Avalanche, we did get a nice trade announcement over the weekend. Certainly not to the blockbuster splashy level that we saw, with the Mikko Rantanen deal, but they made a deal with the Rangers to ship Calvin DeHaan and Juuso Parssinen along with a 2nd and 4th round pick in this upcoming draft in exchange for veteran defenseman Ryan Lindgren, forward Jimmy Vesey, and an unsigned draft commodity in Hank Kempf, also on the defensive side of the ball. This is kind of like, as I said, on par with moves that the Avs are going to be able to make before the deadline this Friday. It's going to be to find depth pieces. Juuso Parssinen was a 3rd and 4th line player who was having to play above those lines for minutes that we didn't really want as it relates to the Colorado Avalanche. So I think that Jimmy Vesey is another 3rd, 4th round player that you're kind of just swapping out opportunities there, and maybe you have some potential to buy low and experience a lift. And then Ryan Lindgren's probably your 2nd defensive pairing for the Avalanche to kind of help bolster some of that depth. Again, that's just the dead horse that we keep beating as it relates to the Colorado Avalanche is, can they find a way to replicate the quality depth scoring and depth defense that they got during their cup run in 2021? Obviously, still too early to tell, so I'm going to reserve most major judgment as it relates to that until we get a little bit of time on ice under the fold to see what this team can really look like. And who knows, maybe we'll have a couple of more moves to speculate between now and Friday. Because if Chris McFarland has proven one thing, it's that he's willing to be active and mobile if he feels like there's an area to mobilize on. Finally, I do want to do a little bit of a preface setup here because we've got a special thing that we're starting here at the Fan for the next 6 weeks or so, and it's called Mile High Milestones. It is all in celebration of the 30th anniversary of Denver Sports 104.3 The Fan, 30 years of covering some of the top sports storylines in the state and being, championships and MVP seasons to, magical runs like Rocktober and special stretches across all the major sports, college and professional, here in the state of Colorado. The Fan has been woven into the fabric of all of it. And so we here at the Fan took a task amongst ourselves to try to see if we could rank the 30 biggest storylines from the last 3 decades in celebration of our 30th anniversary. And today is the inaugural day, starting at number 30, which is the magical season of Ubaldo Jimenez for the Colorado Rockies in 2010. And there are very few people who I think would be better to chat with this about than our friend Ryan Spilborg. Spilly, how you doing, man?
I'm good. It looks like I'm big on the screen. I didn't realize how big my head got. I've always wanted to have one of those big heads, but this looks good enough.
Perspective is everything, right? You lean a little this way, you lean a little that way. Suddenly it changes everything. Well, Spilly, it's so great to talk to you and so great to catch up. You've done some pretty awesome things with us as it relates to the Colorado Rockies over the years, and we certainly enjoy all the insight that you've brought to us and on the broadcasts and just everything that you've kind of woven into your post-playing career. But you were actually a teammate of Ubaldo Jimenez during that season in 2010. And so it's pretty storied, pretty documented, Spilly, the struggles that pitchers have at Coors Field. It's a hitter's ballpark with the dimensions of the ballpark, pitching at altitude, and all the struggles that they face. And so by and large, the narrative has just been the Rockies are, if ever, it's going to be a struggle for them to find consistent ace level pitching year in and year out. And Ubaldo 15 years ago at this point, kind of proved to be the exception to a lot of those rules. He had a magical season. So just from your perspective, from what you can remember being in the locker room at that point, and we'll get into all the things that he did for the first time and things that haven't been marched since, but just what do you remember about that season as it started to unfold?
It was incredible, but I've also known Ubaldo throughout the minor leagues. He was my mom's favorite player. Like this was a guy, to be honest, like there was a start. We are in Modesto and it's low A baseball and he's lobbing the ball like it's an ephus pitch. He was having trouble with the shoulder. And so we're watching Ubaldo, who earlier in the year in low A is throwing, 100 miles an hour. And then at the end, when he comes back from this shoulder injury, he is like afraid to cut it loose. And the first, 9 pitches of a minor league game, every pitch is about 40 miles an hour. He's just lobbing it in. And I watched him walk off the field. I was like, I don't think I've ever seen that before. So to go from that moment to starting in the All-Star game for a Colorado Rocky, and the stuff was always great. Like it's never been about stuff, but there was, you needed to have the mental edge. And one thing that stood out about Ubaldo as I watched him, right? Like I'm telling you, my mom, my late mom, that was her favorite player. Ubaldo was a runner. He loved to run. He used to run like you would find Ubaldo around Denver, especially in 2010. He's like the best pitcher in baseball. And he would run the neighborhood. He would run 5-6 miles a day every single day because he wanted to have stamina to be able to compete at altitude. So he took it to his advantage. And he was a tireless worker and ended up having an unbelievable year.
Yeah, you mentioned kind of the fast start and the way that he was able to progress from the minors to the majors. I mean, he came out of that season on fire. He had 6 straight wins, and in his first 6 starts, he threw the only no-hitter ever by a Rockies pitcher against the Atlanta Braves. And it really just kind of was fascinating to watch because it's one thing we've seen the Rockies jump out to fast starts. They'll start the season 12-3, and then you kind of get into the doldrums of it and things kind of even out. But even if you look at, and this was fascinating doing some of the research ahead of chatting here with you today, at the 50 game mark of that season in 2010, Ubaldo was 10-1 with a 0.78 ERA and 80 innings pitched. It was just, again, numbers that are hard for any pitcher in any ballpark to achieve, let alone the geographical and ballpark restrictions sometimes that Coors Field can make things harder for pitchers. He ended up finishing 19-8 on that year. But in those 7 losses that he picked up after the All-Star break, he only allowed 22 runs. So it just really, I kind of equated it to, and you mentioned he was a starter in the All-Star game. Again, only Rockies pitcher ever to do that. I kind of, it felt like to me, looking back on it, that he was kind of like a fine imported sports car, right? Like when he was on, when the engine was revving, it was magical to watch. But it also kind of felt like once there were some mechanics breakdowns or some mental things that it kind of just, it was hard to replicate some of that same. So what was the stuff for Ubaldo? What was it that made him so successful on the mound, even if we're just looking at the microcosm of that 2010 season?
A lot there. He had a running 2-seam fastball with late movement, so he could spot it up. He was wild enough that he scared hitters. Also had like this split finger fork changeup type pitch with a curveball, and he could throw it at any time. So he had 3+ pitches. He also worked pretty hard. He worked pretty fast. And then getting into deeper games, and he brought that up. The last 7 losses that he had, I mean, our team felt horrible about it. We wanted him to get to 20 wins, and like you start digging into Baseball Reference. He was a 7.5 win starter for the Rockies that year, which was second only to Roy Halladay, who is also from Colorado, right? The late great Roy Halladay, and that's who ended up winning the Cy Young in 2010 was Roy Halladay. He had 21 wins. I believe for the Phillies that year. So, Ubaldo probably should have finished second, to not get credit because so much of Coors Field, I'm sure you talk about it. It's like, oh, well, it's he's a hitter of Coors Field. Look at the numbers are inflated. Well, where's the same thing when it comes to a pitcher?
Right.
If a pitcher's numbers are, let's see, he had a 2.8. He had a 2.8 at Coors Field. What's that the equivalent of, a 0?
Right.
Like if people you can't be like a hypocrite about it. You can't say Coors Field is like a benefit to just hitters. And then when a pitcher shoves, you're like, well, I mean, maybe, like he should have been given the benefit of the doubt pitching in Coors Field versus somebody else that's pitching in Philadelphia. So I don't know. There's always this crazy narrative about Coors Field, and Larry Walker used to say it too. If you think that Coors Field is the PED, then get rid of the field, put it somewhere else so someone's career is not neutered by the environment that you're playing in. Everyone has to play in it. It's not like the other team comes in here and isn't playing Major League Baseball. It's not like these players aren't major leaguers. It's just to pitch at Coors Field is probably one of the more difficult spots in baseball.
100%. And you mentioned the pursuit to get to 20 wins, a feat that a Rockies pitcher has not eclipsed in a single season mark. He finished at 19, and I actually think the season finale of that game was kind of the microcosm of that when you guys played St. Louis, and Ubaldo gives up 0 hits across 8 innings pitched, and you lose 1-0 in the 11th inning. It's like, from a pitcher's perspective, it's a situation where it's like, what more could he have done to try to secure that? And I can imagine that being a little bit of a guilt trip or a little bit of a frustration on you guys as a team of like, how did we not seal the deal collectively to get him that win, to get to that 20 win mark?
Yeah, no question. I mean, we were trying hard. I mean, sometimes when in baseball, if you try too hard, you're not good. And that's what happened to us. I mean, there was so much pressure to try to get him to 20 wins. He could feel it. We could feel it. Jim Tracy, who was the manager at that time, could feel it. He tried everything and he could. There was some just circumstance that happened, but it was still, I mean, for me as a teammate to see Ubaldo start in an all-star game was one of the coolest things ever, because here's your teammate starting in an all-star game, which, a couple of years ago, we thought Herman might get a chance, especially when it was here in Colorado. But I mean, it was Ohtani, who is also starting as a DH, and we've never had that before. So, if Herman would have had the start in the All-Star game over Ohtani, I think we would have felt bad about it, right? Like, as much as I'd love Herman to have had it, to have an All-Star start as a pitcher because he was dominant and hit as a DH, like, you won't see that. You won't see that again. So that was cool.
We flashed a graphic up there earlier. I'll throw it up there one more time because one of my last questions for you is, these are kind of like franchise marks where Ubaldo still ranks at the top of the organization in terms of wins in a season, the whip, hits per 9 innings, and shutouts in a season. Which of those stands out to you as the most impressive or most difficult for other Rockies pitchers since to have to try to chase?
I mean, the whip and hits per 9 are basically, I mean, they're very similar stats. So I like to focus in on whip, but like when you're talking walks, that's one of the things that Ubaldo did have in his game. So hits per 9, to put that one in perspective and see that he was giving up less than 7 hits per 9 when, again, Coors Field.
Yeah, so exactly.
So like sometimes Ubaldo would jam somebody and the ball would get over the infield in front of an outfielder. That's where majority of Coors Field effect comes into play. It's not the ball hit over the outfielder's head for a homer, because we play deep already. It's the balls that you jam somebody, you beat somebody with, and then it falls in the second largest outfield in all of baseball. Like that's where where pitchers get banged up, is they either walk too many people or they have, they pitch to contact and becomes an out. So, I mean, when I think about Ubaldo, he's a ground ball pitcher too with the strikeout, which, like, to give you a comparable now, that's Paul Skeens. Ubaldo was the Rockies' Paul Skeens, and because he was a ground ball pitcher, strikeout, high end stuff. Like, Ubaldo was Paul Skeens before Paul Skeens, and that's why I love that he made it number 30 on this list. But to know that we had, Paul Skeens is like the face of baseball right now. We had multiple faces of baseball in Colorado during that time frame. Tulo was the best shortstop in baseball. You had Ubaldo, and then you had Cargo. Man, like, that team was pretty remarkable. Just the marketing that the Rockies had during that time frame, pretty crazy.
Yeah, certainly a special time, and one that we hope one day we can get back to, as we're all kind of between the 2010s, the early 2010s to the 2018 season with their playoff appearance, and even if you want to go further back to like October, like we do have these tangible memories and moments as it relates to the Rockies of them having, composition wise, the stuff to kind of contend and having moments where it feels like, on any given day, they can take on some of the best in Major League Baseball. And I think that's what makes some of the other times a little bit more frustrating as it relates to, the team's evaluation as a whole. Spilly, on the way out, because I know you got stuff to do here. You're a very busy man. You brought up Shohei Ohtani, who I think is currently, one of the faces of baseball. And there was an interesting conversation around Shohei Ohtani from a cross-sport sense, as we saw Travis Hunter, the standout cornerback and wide receiver for the Colorado Buffaloes at the Combine this past weekend. He plays both ways. He plays wide receiver and cornerback, and he was doing it at a rate in terms of usage and snaps that we hadn't really seen from a college football player ever. And not many have tried. And he put it out there, and I thought it was a pretty interesting shot to call, that he thinks what he does playing wide receiver and corner, getting up at maybe 100 snaps a game between both sides of the ball, is more difficult than what Shohei Ohtani is currently doing as one of the league's premier pitchers and the league's premier hitter in Major League Baseball. As a former baseball player, as someone who spent a lot of time around the game, what are your thoughts on that comparison?
I mean, I like it. I think Hunter has a pretty interesting point, when you're thinking about playing two ways. And I'd like to see him do it at the NFL level. I think he has at least has earned the opportunity to try. However, in football, it's a contact sport. We know that. Like it's a contact sport, so he has the risk of injury every single play. So I like, in that little vacuum, if you're talking about baseball versus football, like where can you get hurt more consistently? It's probably football. So yeah, okay, I'll give you that. But there has never been a pitcher that has pitched and hit in the history of Major League Baseball ever. Like never, ever, ever, ever has never, ever happened. There has never been a pitcher that has been a starting pitcher and a position player, and albeit a DH, in the history of baseball. It's never happened. We have over 24,000 players that have played in the history of baseball. Where's the two-way guy? If it was, I mean, where is he? We've had two-way guys in the NFL. It's happened. We've seen lots of them. You have never seen one in Major League Baseball. And you could go back and go, well, Spilly, what about Babe Ruth? Babe Ruth never pitched and was a position player at the same time. Babe Ruth pitched, and then when he wanted to hit, he stopped pitching and then was just focused on being a position player. He was never pitching and hitting in the exact same week. He was never pitching and hitting in the same game. So you can't make this argument. And you can go back and say, well, what about when pitchers used to hit? It's not even remotely close.
Right.
Because it was once every fifth or sixth day that player was hitting and pitching. So what Ohtani has done, to me, is really, really remarkable, because it has never been done. So you can take it, you can make the rest of your argument however you see fit.
Yeah. In similar ways to how I think you have to fragment and split when you're talking about like the GOAT debate at quarterback in the NFL, right? Like Tom Brady's maybe the most accomplished. Peyton Manning's probably the smartest. Aaron Rodgers, from a physical standpoint, is able to do things that all those guys simultaneously weren't able to do. And there's nuances to it. So when I first saw that headline, my first thought was, okay, and you alluded to it, from a conditioning standpoint, maybe, or a physicality standpoint, you could say what Travis Hunter is doing is maybe a little bit harder in that respect, because he's not having to take. No. You don't think so?
Nope. Because here, like from a once a week football perspective, you're playing one game a week, so you can leave it all out on the field. Baseball starts in February. It ends in November. That's every single day. There's 162 games in 192 days. The days off are travel days. There isn't a day off in there. Ohtani's not taking days. He's playing every day. Pitch, play.
Well, then you remove
completely different. And like baseball players we're marathon runners.
Yeah,
we're marathon runners with the ability to sprint. Football players are sprinters. You know, like they're NASCARs. I mean, like they're revved up for one big event, and then they get the time off to recalibrate.
Well, you essentially removed the only semblance of defense I was going to be able to give Travis Hunter, because my ultimate conclusion is I think hitting a baseball at the major league level is one of the most difficult things to do in all of sports. And the technical elements and the body control and the vision, the processing time that is required to do just that, just a hitting standpoint, is one of the most difficult things, in my opinion, in all of sports. So to be able to do that at some of the highest levels we've seen in recent history, while simultaneously tackling the other most difficult aspect, I think, of baseball, which is being among the league's elite pitchers and being able to master both sides of that, I truly don't think from a skill and tactical technician standpoint that there's an argument between the two. And what Shohei's doing is unprecedented, let alone just impressive. So I was going to try to maybe give like a little bit of a prop up there for Travis, but ultimately for me, it was not a question.
Coach Prime said this 3 months ago. The hardest thing to do in sports is hit a baseball. He did it.
Take it from him himself.
I mean, he did it. He played the NFL and Major League Baseball. Now that would impress me if Travis Hunter can do that again.
Well, we're going to find out pretty soon, because Travis Hunter is most certainly going to go in the top 5, and we'll get to see how or whatever team he goes to and how they want to shake that out. But Spilly, I appreciate you so much for joining us and for catching up and providing some insight as a player who was on that team for, again, one of the more special 30 sports storylines in the last 30 years. And as someone who's taken a sneak peek at the list, there are going to be some more Rockies moments to come in the coming weeks. Spilly, thank you so much for joining us. We know you have a busy schedule, and we'll hopefully catch up with you again soon, my friend.
All right. See you later.
Cheers. To the rest of you out there, have a great rest of your day. We'll see you same time, same place tomorrow.